There are people who walk into a room and immediately know if the atmosphere has changed. They can sense tension before anyone says a word. They notice a person's facial expression, a change in tone, a delayed text message, or a slight shift in body language. To others, this may seem strange. People may say, "You're overthinking," or "You're too sensitive." But what appears to be oversensitivity is often the result of surviving an environment where emotional danger could appear at any moment. The human mind was designed for protection. It constantly gathers information from the environment and asks one important question: am I safe? In healthy relationships, the answer is usually yes. The mind relaxes, the body rests, emotions stabilize. But in narcissistic relationships, safety becomes unpredictable. One moment there is praise, and the next moment there is criticism. One day there is affection, and the next day there is rejection. The rules keep changing, and the person never knows what version of reality they will encounter. As a result, the mind develops an extraordinary ability to scan for danger. It becomes highly alert. It studies facial expressions, analyzes words, and watches for subtle changes in behavior. This is not weakness, it is adaptation. Imagine living in a house where a storm could begin without warning. You would eventually learn to watch the sky constantly. You would pay attention to every cloud, every gust of wind, and every shift in temperature. Why? Because your mind would be trying to protect you from being caught off guard. This is exactly what many survivors of narcissistic abuse experience. They become emotional meteorologists. They study people and environments because unpredictability once caused them pain. The problem is that even after the relationship ends, the nervous system often continues operating as if danger is still present. The person may enter healthy environments but remain on high alert. They may expect criticism when none exists. They may prepare for rejection that is never coming. Their mind keeps searching for threats because it was trained to believe that threats can appear at any moment. This constant alertness is exhausting. It consumes mental energy. It creates anxiety. It makes relaxation feel unfamiliar. Sometimes survivors become so accustomed to living in survival mode that peace itself feels uncomfortable. Silence feels suspicious. Kindness feels confusing. Stability feels temporary. Many survivors blame themselves for this. They wonder why they cannot simply relax. They question why they pay attention to details that others ignore. They become frustrated with themselves for anticipating problems before they happen. But healing begins when they understand an important truth. Your nervous system is not trying to sabotage you. It is trying to protect you. The body remembers experiences. The mind remembers patterns. If criticism repeatedly followed certain behaviors, the brain remembers. If rejection often arrived unexpectedly, the brain remembers. If emotional attacks came without warning, the brain remembers. Memory is not only intellectual, it is emotional and physiological. The body learns what environments feel dangerous and responds automatically. This is why healing requires patience. You cannot punish yourself into peace. You cannot shame yourself into feeling safe. You cannot command your nervous system to instantly forget experiences that took years to develop. Instead, healing comes through understanding and retraining. You gradually teach yourself that not every disagreement leads to abandonment. Not every silence means rejection. Not every change in tone is an attack. Not every delayed response is evidence that something is wrong. You begin learning the difference between actual danger and remembered danger. This process requires compassion toward yourself. Every time you become anxious or overly alert, remember that these reactions were developed for survival. They once served a purpose. They helped you navigate difficult circumstances. They helped you endure situations that demanded constant awareness. However, survival mechanisms are not meant to become permanent residences. They are emergency responses. A person who survives a storm eventually leaves the shelter and rebuilds. Likewise, emotional healing involves slowly stepping out of survival mode and learning to experience safety again. This does not happen overnight. It happens through small experiences. It happens every time someone treats you with consistency. It happens every time you realize that you can express yourself without being attacked. It happens every time you discover that healthy relationships do not require constant monitoring and emotional exhaustion. Over time, the mind begins to relax. The nervous system learns new patterns. The heart starts believing that peace is possible. The extraordinary thing about human beings is that the same mind that learned fear can also learn safety. The same person who became hypervigilant can also become peaceful. The same individual who constantly anticipated danger can eventually experience trust and emotional stability. You are not broken because you pay attention to details others overlook. You are not defective because you notice shifts in people's behavior. You develop these abilities while navigating uncertainty and emotional unpredictability. But your future is not limited to survival. You can move beyond constant alertness. You can learn to rest. You can learn that safety is not an illusion. You can train your mind to recognize that your present circumstances are different from your past experiences. And perhaps one of the greatest victories in healing is this: reaching a place where you no longer feel responsible for predicting every storm because you have finally discovered that your life is no longer controlled by one. Trust is one of the most valuable assets a human being possesses. Every healthy relationship, every meaningful friendship, every successful partnership, and every strong family connection is built upon it. Trust allows people to feel safe enough to be vulnerable, honest, and authentic. But when a person experiences narcissistic abuse, trust becomes one of the first casualties of that experience. A survivor of narcissistic abuse often develops a deep difficulty trusting others. And to people who have never gone through this kind of emotional trauma, this behavior may seem strange. They may wonder, why are you so cautious? Why do you question people's intentions? Why do you keep your guard up? What they do not understand is that trust was not merely disappointed. It was systematically damaged. Narcissistic abuse creates an environment where words and actions constantly contradict each other. A person may say they love you while intentionally hurting you. They may promise loyalty while betraying your confidence. They may claim to care about your feelings while repeatedly invalidating them. Over time, your mind becomes confused because it can no longer predict reality accurately. Human beings naturally seek consistency. We depend on patterns to make sense of the world. When someone repeatedly says one thing and does another, your mind enters a state of uncertainty. You begin questioning your judgment. You start wondering whether your perceptions are accurate. Eventually, trust in other people starts weakening because your experiences have taught you that appearances can be deceptive. Many survivors become experts at reading between the lines. They pay close attention to facial expressions, changes in tone, and subtle behaviors that others might ignore. They are constantly searching for signs that someone may be dishonest or manipulative. To an outside observer, this can look like suspicion or negativity. In reality, it is often a survival response. Your mind remembers pain. It remembers betrayal. It remembers promises that were broken and words that were used as weapons. Because of those memories, it attempts to protect you from future harm. It creates emotional barriers and tells you to be careful. The problem is that these protective mechanisms do not always distinguish between dangerous people and healthy people. The mind simply remembers that trust once resulted in pain, and therefore, it becomes reluctant to trust again. This is why many survivors hesitate when someone compliments them. They wonder if the kindness is genuine. They become uncomfortable when someone shows affection because they have learned that affection can sometimes be followed by manipulation. They question motives because their experiences taught them that good intentions are not always what they seem. Some survivors even struggle to trust themselves. This may be one of the deepest wounds of narcissistic abuse. When you have spent years being told that your feelings are wrong, your memories are inaccurate, or your perceptions cannot be trusted, you eventually begin doubting your own judgment. You may ask yourself, am I overreacting? Did I misunderstand the situation? Maybe I'm being too sensitive. These questions become automatic because your confidence in your own perception has been weakened. But understand this principle. The fact that you struggle to trust does not mean there is something wrong with you. It means something happened to you. Your caution did not appear without reason. It was developed in response to repeated emotional injuries. However, while caution can protect you, living in permanent distrust can also become a prison. If you believe everyone is dangerous, you may unintentionally keep healthy relationships at a distance. If you assume every act of kindness hides harmful intentions, you may reject genuine love and support. Healing requires learning an important distinction. Not everyone deserves your trust immediately, but not everyone should be permanently denied the opportunity to earn it. Trust is not supposed to be blind. Trust is supposed to be built. It grows through consistency, honesty, accountability, and time. Healthy people do not demand instant trust. They demonstrate reliability repeatedly until trust develops naturally. Healing also means learning to trust yourself again. Your perceptions matter. Your feelings deserve attention. Your intuition has value. The fact that someone manipulated you does not mean you are incapable of making wise judgments. It means you encountered someone skilled at creating confusion. One painful experience does not define your future relationships. One betrayal does not determine the character of every person you will meet. There are people who say what they mean and mean what they say. There are people whose actions match their words. There are people who respect boundaries, honor commitments, and value honesty. The goal is not to become naive again. The goal is not to trust everyone without wisdom. The goal is to become healthy enough to recognize the difference between danger and safety. A survivor's difficulty trusting others is not weakness. It is evidence that they have endured experiences that taught them to be careful, but healing gradually teaches them another lesson. Wisdom can coexist with openness, discernment can coexist with hope, and caution can coexist with healthy relationships. Trust may have been damaged, but it can be rebuilt. And when it is rebuilt with wisdom, self-respect, and discernment, it often becomes stronger than it was before. One of the strangest behaviors that many survivors of narcissistic abuse develop is the habit of apologizing excessively. They say, "I'm sorry," for things that are not their fault. They apologize for asking a question, for expressing an opinion, for taking too long to reply to a message, for being tired, for needing space, and sometimes even for simply existing. To people who have not experienced narcissistic abuse, this behavior may seem unnecessary or irrational. But in reality, excessive apologizing is not a sign of weakness. It is often evidence of prolonged emotional conditioning. Human beings are learners. We adapt ourselves to our environments. Whatever environment you remain in long enough will begin to influence your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. In a healthy environment, mistakes become opportunities to learn and grow. But in a narcissistically abusive environment, mistakes become weapons. Everything becomes your fault. If the narcissist is angry, somehow you are responsible. If they are unhappy, you must have caused it. If they fail, they blame you. If there is conflict, you become the problem. Over time, the survivor's mind begins to create an equation. If I take the blame, maybe I can avoid conflict. If I apologize quickly, maybe I can restore peace. If I accept responsibility, maybe I can prevent rejection. What begins as a temporary survival strategy slowly becomes a permanent habit. This is why many survivors apologize automatically. They do not stop to think whether they have actually done something wrong. Their response is immediate because their nervous system has been trained to believe that conflict is dangerous. The apology becomes a shield. It becomes an attempt to preserve safety. The tragedy is that many survivors continue this behavior long after the abusive relationship has ended. They walk into new relationships carrying old programming. They enter healthy environments with unhealthy expectations. They continue apologizing because their minds are still operating according to rules that no longer exist. Imagine carrying an umbrella every day because it rained continuously for years. Even after the storm has ended, you keep expecting rain because your experience taught you that rain was inevitable. Excessive apologizing works the same way. The storm may be over, but the mind is still preparing for another one. This behavior also reveals something important about human dignity. Every person was created with value and worth. Your existence is not an inconvenience. Your opinions are not burdens. Your emotions are not crimes. Your needs do not require an apology. Many survivors were made to feel as though taking up space was offensive. They learned to become smaller, quieter, and less demanding. They learned to apologize for having boundaries, preferences, and emotions. They became experts at making themselves comfortable for everyone else while becoming increasingly uncomfortable within themselves. Eventually, the words, "I'm sorry," become attached to almost every aspect of life. I'm sorry for bothering you. I'm sorry for asking. I'm sorry for feeling this way. I'm sorry, I need help. Yet none of these things require an apology because being human is not an offense. One of the greatest lessons in healing is learning the difference between responsibility and blame. Responsible people acknowledge genuine mistakes and make corrections when necessary. But survivors of narcissistic abuse often carry blame for situations they never created and problems they could never solve. You are not responsible for another person's inability to regulate their emotions. You are not responsible for someone else's cruelty, manipulation, or selfish behavior. You are not responsible for making everyone comfortable at the expense of your own peace. Healing begins when survivors become aware of this conditioning. Awareness creates freedom. The moment you recognize why you apologize excessively, you can begin changing the pattern. You can pause before saying, "I'm sorry," and ask yourself an important question. Have I actually done something wrong? Sometimes the answer will be yes, and an apology will be appropriate, but many times the answer will be no. You may simply be expressing an opinion. You may be asking for clarification. You may be communicating a need. You may be exercising your right to exist authentically. In those moments, an apology is unnecessary. Instead of saying, "I'm sorry for taking your time," you can say, "Thank you for your time." Instead of saying, "I'm sorry for asking," you can say, "I appreciate your willingness to listen." These small changes begin retraining the mind. They teach the nervous system that communication does not always lead to punishment. The goal of healing is not to become rude or insensitive. The goal is to restore balance. It is to understand that your voice matters, your feelings matter, your presence matters. You do not need permission to have needs. You do not need forgiveness for having boundaries. You do not need to apologize for occupying space in this world. The fact that you apologize excessively does not mean you are weak. It means you adapted to an environment where blame was used as a tool of control. It means you became skilled at seeking peace in the only way you knew how. But now you have the opportunity to learn a different way of living. You can exchange unnecessary guilt for self-respect. You can replace fear with confidence. You can stop carrying blame that was never yours to bear. And perhaps one of the most powerful forms of healing is reaching the place where you no longer feel compelled to say, "I'm sorry for being me," because you finally understand that your existence has value and your humanity never required an apology. One of the strangest behaviors many survivors develop is the habit of over-explaining themselves. They explain why they were late. They explain why they are tired. They explain why they made a certain decision. They explain why they said no. Sometimes they even explain their feelings before anyone asks. To an outside observer, this can appear like insecurity, but it is much deeper than that. It is usually a learned survival response. Human beings are designed to live with a sense of emotional safety. In healthy relationships, people are allowed to make decisions without constantly defending themselves. They can make mistakes without fear of humiliation. They can have opinions without being interrogated. They can say no without expecting punishment. But narcissistic abuse removes this sense of safety. It creates an environment where every decision is questioned, every emotion is challenged, and every action is placed under a microscope. Over time, the survivor learns an unhealthy lesson. I must justify everything I do. This lesson is not learned in a single day. It develops through repeated experiences. Every time the survivor's motives are questioned, they become more defensive. Every time their words are twisted, they become more careful. Every time they are falsely accused, they start gathering evidence to prove their innocence. Every time they are blamed for something they did not do, they become experts at preparing explanations. Eventually, explaining becomes automatic. The survivor may not even realize they are doing it. They have been conditioned to believe that every action requires a defense and every choice requires permission. They begin carrying an invisible burden, feeling responsible for making everyone understand and approve of their decisions. The tragedy is that this habit often continues long after the abusive relationship has ended. The body may have left the toxic environment, but the mind is still operating according to old rules. The survivor still feels as though they are standing before a judge who is waiting to criticize them. They still feel they must convince people that their feelings are valid, their decisions are reasonable, and their boundaries are justified. This constant need to explain is emotionally exhausting. Imagine carrying a heavy bag every day without realizing it. Eventually, your shoulders become tired and your movements become slower. In the same way, constantly defending your existence drains emotional energy. It creates anxiety and keeps you in a permanent state of self-consciousness. The survivor begins living as though they are on trial. But life was never meant to be lived that way. Mature relationships are built on mutual respect. Respect means understanding that every person has the right to think differently, choose differently, and establish personal boundaries without presenting a detailed argument. You do not need a courtroom presentation to explain why you need rest. You do not need a lengthy speech to justify protecting your peace. You do not need a 10-minute explanation to validate your emotions. You do not need universal approval to make healthy decisions for your life. One of the most important parts of healing is understanding that explanations are not always necessary. Sometimes a simple answer is enough. Sometimes no answer is required at all. This does not mean becoming rude or inconsiderate. It means recognizing your value as a human being. Your worth does not depend on how successfully you convince other people to agree with you. Healthy people respect boundaries. Healthy people do not demand endless explanations. Healthy people do not make you feel guilty for having needs. One reason survivors over-explain is because they fear being misunderstood. They know the pain of having their intentions misrepresented. They know what it feels like to have their words twisted and their character attacked. As a result, they try to prevent future misunderstandings by providing excessive details. But there is an important lesson to learn. Not everyone who misunderstands you can be convinced by more information. Some people misunderstand because they lack information. Others misunderstand because they have already decided not to understand. No amount of explanation can satisfy someone who is committed to misinterpreting you. Understanding this truth is liberating. It frees you from the impossible assignment of managing everyone's perceptions of you. It teaches you that your responsibility is to communicate honestly, not to control every opinion people form about you. You cannot spend your entire life trying to be perfectly understood by everyone. That is emotional slavery. Freedom begins when you realize that your decisions do not become valid because other people approve of them. They become valid because they are aligned with wisdom, truth, and personal responsibility. Healing means giving yourself permission to stop defending your right to exist, your right to think, your right to rest, and your right to establish boundaries. You are allowed to make decisions without writing an essay about them. You are allowed to protect your peace without apologizing for it. You are allowed to say no without feeling guilty. You are allowed to choose yourself without presenting evidence for your choice. The need to over-explain was once a survival strategy. It helped you navigate an environment where criticism and accusation were common. But survival strategies are not meant to become permanent identities. The person you are becoming no longer needs to stand before an imaginary courtroom. You are not on trial. Your voice matters, your feelings matter, your boundaries matter, and your existence does not require a constant defense. One of the most misunderstood behaviors of survivors of narcissistic abuse is their tendency to withdraw from people and isolate themselves emotionally and socially. Family members may say, "You've changed." Friends may wonder why the person no longer attends gatherings, answers calls, or seems excited about relationships. To someone looking from the outside, this behavior may appear rude, antisocial, or even selfish. However, in many cases, isolation is not a rejection of people. It is a response to prolonged emotional exhaustion. Human beings are naturally designed for connection. We are wired to build relationships, share experiences, and find comfort in meaningful interactions. Healthy relationships provide support, encouragement, and a sense of belonging. However, when relationships become sources of manipulation, criticism, confusion, and emotional pain, the mind and body begin to associate closeness with danger rather than safety. Narcissistic abuse creates a condition where a person is constantly emotionally engaged yet emotionally deprived. The survivor may spend years trying to understand mixed signals, seeking approval, defending themselves against accusations, and attempting to maintain peace in an unpredictable environment. This process consumes tremendous emotional energy. It is mentally exhausting because the person remains in a continuous state of alertness, trying to avoid conflict and anticipating the next emotional injury. Eventually, the nervous system becomes overwhelmed. The mind begins searching for relief, and one of the ways it finds relief is through withdrawal. Solitude starts feeling safer than social interaction because solitude offers something the survivor has not experienced for a long time: peace. This behavior is similar to what happens to a person who has been exposed to loud noise for an extended period. When they finally enter a quiet room, they do not immediately want more stimulation. They want silence because silence allows recovery. In the same way, many survivors withdraw because their emotional systems are overstimulated and fatigued. The isolation often extends beyond physical withdrawal. Many survivors become emotionally guarded. They stop sharing their thoughts, dreams, and feelings. They may keep conversations superficial and avoid discussing personal matters. This does not necessarily mean they no longer value relationships. Rather, they have learned through painful experiences that vulnerability can sometimes be used against them. Repeated emotional injuries can create a belief that opening up to others is dangerous. The survivor remembers occasions when their emotions were mocked, dismissed, manipulated, or turned into weapons against them. As a result, the mind develops a protective strategy. If I reveal less, I can be hurt less. This strategy may successfully reduce immediate emotional risks, but it can also create unintended consequences. Isolation can eventually lead to loneliness, misunderstandings, and difficulties reconnecting with healthy people. The very protection that once brought relief can slowly become a prison if it continues indefinitely. Understanding this process is extremely important because survivors often judge themselves harshly for their withdrawal. They may believe something is wrong with them because they no longer enjoy social activities or because they need long periods of solitude. They may wonder why they cannot simply return to their former selves. The answer is that healing is not merely about returning to who you were before. Healing often involves becoming someone wiser and more self-aware than before. Recovery requires understanding what your mind and body are communicating. Sometimes your need for solitude is not weakness, it is restoration. Sometimes your withdrawal is not evidence that you dislike people. It is evidence that your emotional reserves have been depleted. Sometimes your silence is not a sign of failure. It is your inner world attempting to recover from experiences that demanded more emotional strength than anyone around you realized. However, restoration should not become permanent disconnection. Recovery involves learning that although certain relationships cause pain, not all relationships are dangerous. It means gradually teaching your nervous system that healthy connection exists. It means discovering that there are people who listen without judgment, respect boundaries, communicate honestly, and appreciate you without requiring you to abandon yourself. Healing also requires granting yourself permission to move at your own pace. Emotional recovery cannot be forced. Trust cannot be manufactured overnight. Safety must be experienced consistently before it is believed. You are not obligated to become instantly social simply because others think you should. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to protect your peace. You are allowed to step back and regain your emotional strength. At the same time, you must remember that your future is not meant to be defined by fear and permanent isolation. The goal is not to hide from the world forever. The goal is to become whole enough that relationships no longer feel like battlefields. The remarkable truth is that the part of you that withdraws is often the same part of you that still hopes for genuine connection. Deep within every healthy human being remains the desire to be understood, respected, and loved authentically. Your temporary isolation may be a season of rebuilding. It may be the place where your mind learns peace again, where your confidence returns, and where your identity is restored. And when healing progresses, you can re-enter relationships not as someone desperately seeking validation, but as someone who understands their worth, values their peace, and chooses connection from strength rather than from need. One of the strangest experiences for survivors of narcissistic abuse is the guilt they feel when they finally begin setting boundaries. To people who have never experienced this kind of manipulation, boundaries seem normal. Saying, "I don't want that," "I disagree," or "I need some time for myself," appears healthy and reasonable. But for someone who has endured narcissistic abuse, these simple actions can trigger anxiety, fear, and overwhelming guilt. This happens because narcissistic relationships often train people to ignore themselves. Over time, survivors are conditioned to believe that their value comes from keeping others happy. They learn to measure their worth by how much they give, how much they tolerate, and how much of themselves they sacrifice. Their identity slowly becomes connected to pleasing people, avoiding conflict, and meeting everyone's expectations. The problem with this conditioning is that it creates an unhealthy definition of love. Love becomes synonymous with self-denial. Kindness becomes endless availability. Compassion becomes the acceptance of mistreatment. The survivor begins to believe that being a good person means having no personal limits. Think about the psychological burden of this belief. Every time the survivor wants to say no, an internal conflict begins. One part of them recognizes the need for rest, protection, and self-respect. Another part immediately produces guilt and fear. Thoughts emerge such as, "Am I being selfish? Will they be angry with me? Will they leave me? Am I a bad person for choosing myself? Will they leave me? Am." The human mind adapts to repeated experiences. If someone is punished every time they express a need, eventually they stop expressing needs altogether. If they are criticized every time they establish limits, they begin believing that boundaries are dangerous. If they are made to feel guilty for protecting themselves, they start associating self-care with wrongdoing. This is why many survivors become people who say yes when they want to say no. They give when they are emotionally exhausted. They remain available even when they need rest. They continue helping others while neglecting themselves. They fear disappointing everyone except themselves. The tragedy is that they become experts at caring for others while becoming strangers to their own needs. Healthy boundaries, however, are not acts of selfishness. They are acts of wisdom. Every healthy relationship requires boundaries because boundaries define responsibility. They communicate what is acceptable and what is not. They protect emotional well-being. They preserve dignity. They make relationships sustainable. Even nature teaches this principle. Every nation has borders. Every home has walls and doors. Every organization has policies and limits. Boundaries are not signs of rejection. They are structures that protect what is valuable. Human beings also require emotional boundaries. You have limited energy, limited time, and limited emotional capacity. You cannot continuously pour into others while neglecting yourself and expect to remain healthy. Constant self-sacrifice eventually produces exhaustion, resentment, and emotional depletion. Many survivors fear boundaries because they mistake them for cruelty. But refusing harmful behavior is not cruelty. Saying no to manipulation is not selfishness. Choosing peace over chaos is not abandonment. Prioritizing your mental and emotional health is not a moral failure. In reality, boundaries reveal self-respect. When you establish boundaries, you communicate an important message to yourself and to others. My feelings matter, my needs matter, my well-being matters. This can feel uncomfortable at first because it contradicts years of conditioning. The guilt may still appear, anxiety may still arise. Some people may even react negatively because they benefited from your lack of boundaries. They may accuse you of changing, becoming selfish, or becoming difficult, but change is exactly what healing requires. Recovery from narcissistic abuse involves learning an entirely new relationship with yourself. It means understanding that your purpose in life is not to carry everyone's emotional burdens. It means recognizing that your value does not come from endless sacrifice. It means accepting that saying no to what harms you allows you to say yes to what helps you grow. The guilt you feel when setting boundaries is often a sign that you are doing something unfamiliar, not something wrong. Every healthy boundary becomes an act of restoration. Every respectful no strengthens your sense of identity. Every decision to honor your needs teaches your mind a new lesson. You are allowed to exist without apologizing for your limits. The remarkable truth is this: the people who genuinely care about you will eventually learn to respect your boundaries. Those who become angry often reveal that they preferred access to your self-neglect rather than appreciation for your well-being. Healing requires courage because it asks you to believe something that narcissistic abuse tried to erase from your mind. You have the right to protect your peace, honor your needs, and establish limits without carrying the burden of guilt. Boundaries do not make you selfish. They make you healthy, balanced, and emotionally free.